Fiscal reform to benefit state and local governments. The Modern Money Theory Approach by L. Randall Wray. Fiscal reform in the era of Trumpism. As we've discussed, financial affordability is not a problem for the sovereign government, though state and local governments are fiscally constrained. The dollar currency area thus has advantages over the Eurozone, but only if the federal government uses its policy space wisely. Unfortunately, over the past 45 years or so, the notion that our national government should be fiscally responsible has come to dominate. Further, orthodox economists have downgraded the usefulness of fiscal policy and shifted responsibility for macroeconomic performance to the central bank. This means that policy became much more focused on inflation than on employment and economic growth. When growth is too slow and inflation is too low, the Fed lowers its rate target. This will work only on spending that is highly interest sensitive, mostly in asset markets. That is why our business cycle has become so dependent on speculative bubbles in real estate, the stock market, commodities markets, and derivatives that allow betting on financial asset performance. Chronic secular stagnation is relieved by bubbles that eventually burst. Finally, to the extent that fiscal policy is used, it relies on tax cuts, mostly on higher incomes, on capital gains, and on corporate profits. None of these are very efficient. Indeed, they tend to reinforce the effects of interest rate cuts, encouraging speculation in assets. Since growth of production and income is not encouraged, tax cuts are accompanied by declining tax revenue that adds fuel to the deficit hawks who worry about the unsustainable growth of government debt. Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Acts, TCJA, was just the latest in the long series of reforms. For our purposes, one of the most important features was that it capped state and local tax deductions at $10,000, while raising the standard deduction. The impacts will be greatest in high-tax states, such as New York and California, which have used high-income property and sales taxes to support more spending. It is estimated that a large majority of taxpayers who used to itemize will now take the standard deduction, potentially paying substantially more in federal taxes. There will be pressure on high-tax states and local governments to reform taxes, with a likely increase of the regressivity of state and local taxes. Generally, the high-tax states added to the progressivity of federal taxes, so that if they cut taxes on higher-income households, they will become more like the average state that has highly regressive taxes. Gordon, 2018. While Uncle Sam has the capacity to distribute income to states on a progressive basis, he has never done enough. According to the Urban Institute in 2012, federal transfers accounted for 23% of state and local government revenue, while property taxes, income taxes, and sales taxes contributed 47%. Gordon, Auxier, and Iselin, 2016. Even with federal funding, about half the states would fall short of raising sufficient revenue to meet their needs, even if they raised their own taxes toward the average rates. Footnote 16. The methodology used adjusts revenue capacity by the state's economic base. States with low income, sales, and property values have a lower base and will not raise the same amount of revenue for given tax rates. See Gordon, Auxier, and Iselin, 2016. End footnote. In other words, even with greater revenue effort, half the states cannot meet their needs with the sum of their potential revenue, plus the current level of help from the federal government. State and local governments are responsible for a large percentage of the public services a developed country like the United States expects. Quote, "The United States is a highly decentralized country. For example, state and local governments fund 85% of and deliver all public elementary and secondary education. They undertake 3/4 of all government spending on roads, bridges, water treatment facilities, and other infrastructure. They incarcerate 90% of prison and jail inmates. State and local governments help maintain the social safety net through their own public assistance programs and their participation in joint federal-state programs, such as Medicaid and temporary assistance for needy families. Gordon, Auxier, and Iselin, 2016. End quote. This decentralization has its disadvantages because both fiscal capacity and needs vary considerably across the country. As discussed, the federal government's fiscal capacity is much greater, and it can use grants and other transfers to help close the fiscal gap between capacity to raise revenue and funding needs faced by state and local governments. Quote, in 2014, the federal government distributed $577 billion in grants to states and local governments, equivalent to about 17% of total federal outlays or 3.3% of GDP. The majority, 55% of federal grant dollars, went to fund health programs, predominantly Medicaid. This allocation represents a departure from the 1950s and 1960s, when transportation and community development programs represented a greater share of the total. Gordon, Auxier, and Iselin, 2016. End quote. However, the federal government has never really provided funding at the necessary level to tackle state and local fiscal gaps, and has never provided much general purpose revenue. Even at its peak, general revenue sharing only amounted to 1.5% of federal spending between 1976 to 1982. Gordon, Auxier, and Iselin, 2016. Since the end of the 1970s, with the exception of the Medicaid program, federal transfers to states have not been well targeted to make up for fiscal gaps. Moving forward, true reform would involve more funding flowing from Washington to state and local governments. While there are many ways to go about doing this, we will suggest 4 main programs, 3 of which are closely tied to the Levy Economic Institute's Green New Deal G&D proposal. Healthcare for all through a single-payer program, formulated along the lines of the traditional Medicare program. A universal job guarantee program that pays $15 per hour with basic benefits, including child care. A national infrastructure program to green the economy and bring it into the 21st century. And general revenue sharing and or block grants for states to replace revenue lost by phasing out regressive taxes. Footnote 17. We will only briefly summarize the proposal here. For more details, see Narcissian and Wray, 2019. End footnote. As the first 3 are part of the Levy Green New Deal program, we won't go into details here except to summarize impacts on state budgets. The single-payer Medicare for All program would eliminate most federal and state spending on Medicaid. Whether there would still be a role for Medicaid to play would depend on the range of care services covered. For example, would it include long-term care and nursing homes? As well as most state and local government spending on health care for their employees and retirees. State and local governments might want to offer extra benefits beyond what Medicare for All provides. Clearly, this reform would provide huge savings for state and local governments. The Levy Institute, Wray et al. 2018, has simulated the effects of a universal job guarantee program that would directly employ 15 million workers, while creating an additional 4 million private sector workers. It would raise GDP and national income by about $500 billion and boost state budget revenues by $53 billion. The job guarantee projects would be undertaken by nonprofits and state and local governments, with the wages and benefits paid by the federal government. Projects would be largely devoted to care services, care for the environment, communities, and people. The intent is to supplement, not replace, what state and local governments already do, providing a pool of employed labor to undertake new projects. The simulation assumes the federal government would also provide funding equal to 25% of the job guarantee wage bill to cover materials and administration costs. It is possible that state and local governments would need to provide some additional funding for supervision, training, materials, and administration, but most program costs would be covered by the national federal government. The job guarantee projects could include greening projects, but probably would not include any major infrastructure projects due to the prevailing wage laws and the Davis-Bacon Act, which would require higher wages. However, the Levy Green New Deal proposal includes substantial new federal spending to mitigate climate change, greening projects to move to carbon-neutral energy sources, etc., alone would amount to 5% of GDP annually. Other public infrastructure costs have not been estimated, but would likely amount to several percent of GDP per year. All of this spending would help to revitalize local economies and to provide 21st century infrastructure. Finally, we need a policy of federal funding for state and local governments that would reduce the use of regressive taxes, if not eliminate them. This could be done on a voluntary basis, with built-in incentives so that revenue lost from the reduction of regressive taxes would be more than offset by federal funding. Total funding made available should be linked to the fiscal effort made, and as well to needs. Hence, three factors would be important determinants of the funding provided: fiscal effort, need, and willingness to move from regressive to progressive taxes. Obviously, this will require more research and thought to create a workable formula. The most important point is that the federal government can and should take more responsibility for providing the funding for state and local government spending. The first step is to understand that the fiscal capacity of the federal government is not determined by its inherited debt ratio, by its tax revenue, or by bond vigilantes. This does not mean that government can spend without limit. Spending should be limited by the quantity of resources that can and should be devoted to the pursuit of the public purpose. Exactly what is the public purpose and what should be left for the pursuit of private interest will remain a politically contentious issue. But we can first ensure that all of today's resources are fully mobilized. If used wisely, there will be more resources available for the future. Our most valuable resource, labor, cannot be simply stored for later use. For the most part, whatever we do not use now is lost forever, and its future potential can even be degraded by idleness today.